Okay, we'll carry on. We're coming to the end now of the first big topic of this module, which is the history of cognitive science. And we've seen how the concerns of cognitive science are, in some respects, very old concerns. And we tracked a little bit the history of the philosophy of mind with the broad awareness of the continual swing between the two poles of rationalism focusing on the intellect and reason, and empiricism focusing on the sensory motor embedding of an organism in the world and learning from experience. And then against that, we set the much younger history of the science of psychology since about the middle of the 19th century. We looked a little bit about these very multifaceted origins of this fascinating discipline, and we looked a bit at behaviorist approaches which sought to deal with some of the complexity of approaching minds by simply ruling minds out of bounds and restricting their observations to behavior. Then we met the last day, we met this important turn in the middle of the 20th century where a new language emerged. This is the language of information processing, and a new set of metaphors were available suddenly, which is the metaphor of the computer. And the formal mathematical scientific approach taken sought to use this language in approaching classical issues within cognitive science. So we saw, as a landmark event, the critique, withering critique it must be said, by Noam Chomsky of Skinner's attempts to apply behaviorist approaches to the study of language. Chomsky, of course, famously pointed out that language is not simply a set of habits, it's something we do creatively. Now, Chomsky's interests were in the domain of language, and in particular, he focused on syntax, that is, the rule-based ordering of words which underlie every language, such that we can say this is an English sentence or this is not an English sentence. And that's all done without reference to meaning, but the insight is that if you have the right rules, then the reorderings that are possible of the symbols that you have will come to mean different things if they're embedded in the right set of, in the right kind of system. This is very much computer science thinking brought to bear on language, because Chomsky also studied artificial languages and computer languages, which are bunches of symbols which are organized according to rules, and when correctly interpreted, that gives rise to programs which do things. So the interpretation of these strings of symbols leads to meaning, the creation of meaning. Chomsky represents a reintroduction of strongly rationalist concerns. Where the behaviorists have been focusing on learning from experience, Chomsky here is focusing very much on an abstract intellect. One of his main points was to argue that children couldn't possibly learn language from scratch. They had to be born ready to learn the details of a specific language, but they couldn't possibly face the task of learning language as a whole from scratch. So his emphasis on innateness, that which is innate, which is built into a newly born organism, that's another of these strongly rationalist concerns. And what he claimed that people possessed, this readiness to learn language, he called a universal grammar. Given that that was built in, according to his claims, then the learner's task becomes much smaller. It becomes one of just learning those details that identify a language as English as opposed to Chinese. And if Chomsky's concerns were primarily with language, this shift in vocabulary to computers and information processing was running through very many subjects, very many topics, including the philosophy of mind. And we met Jerry Fodor, who started coming up with trying to flesh out a computational theory of mind, first of all trying to describe thinking and reasoning as if they were computer programs broke down into little sub-programs, each of which did a specific task. And we also saw that he made an explicit link to this theory of language, in which Fodor suggested that some of what we want to capture by this difficult word, thinking, is language-like, that we are thinking in sentences, and furthermore that the structure of the thought is pretty much the structure of a sentence. We had this example, the thought that I would like a pie might, it was suggested by Fodor, corresponds to a structure very much like the language structure, the syntactic structure, I would like a pie. And we met finally this statement of what a computational theory of mind is. We'll just skip to the meaty bits. The idea being that intentional processes, that is, these symbols with which we're thinking or with which we're speaking, they're about something. And this property of aboutness is called intentionality. So that we need to understand how it is that reasoning can be about something that's not present. Speaking can be about something that's not present. So that's how he sees the task of understanding thought. His approach is syntactic, so it has to do with the reordering of symbols in accordance with rules. This is the new language of computers and information processing that has just emerged. And he says these syntactic processes, the symbols, whoa, sorry about that, are over mental representations. And the mental representations we'll come to later on in this course, but the idea is basically the data with which we're thinking and that's being reorganized and shuffled. This is what he's calling a representation. Now we've seen, that's as far as we've got. And with this, there's a great big change, an intellectual change in very many disciplines, not only in psychology. For example, this new language gives rise to a peculiar beast called artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, you've all heard the term. It's very much the subject of current debate. You've seen movies based on artificial intelligence. That term arose around this time. It was introduced, the term artificial intelligence was introduced by Marvin Minsky, who, bless him, died last week. Here we see one of the kinds of statements that were foundational for artificial intelligence. This one is from 1963, and it's by Alan Newell, who was a psychologist, and Herb Simon, who had a Nobel Prize in economics, not in cognitive science. And they had suggested, this is the kind of way you build a computational theory, they suggested that if you want to make something which appears to be intelligent, whose behavior appears to be intelligent, what you need is what they called a physical symbol system. So it's a symbol system which contains a lot of symbols that are organized by rules. They need to be instantiated in something, so that's why it has to be a physical symbol system. And if you do this correctly, they suggested, if you get the right kind of rules, you have the right kind of system, then you have the basis for building a system which displays intelligent action. And we'll see why they believe this as well. Now, the symbols that they're talking about are much like words, and there's this close association between more or less this atomistic view of thought and the structure of language. These words, just as words can only be rearranged in certain ways, and there are rules as to what orders make sense and what orders don't, so they suggested in a physical symbol system, moving the symbols around would have to be done according to rules, and you have to get the rules right in order to make this system display intelligent behavior. Look what's happened. We've gone from studying how animals, pigeons and dogs and so on, learn from experience to a completely different set of concerns. We're now concerned with intelligence. Intelligence conceived of as something very, very abstract, something far removed from experience, far removed from the senses, far removed from the body. This is a very intellectual approach. And the kind of problems that these early AI, artificial intelligence programs, set out to solve, or the intelligent behavior that was displayed, were ones like this. Now, when I was a kid, I had a little set like these. There are 3 invisible pins you can't see here, and there's a stack of disks from big to little, and the job is to move one disk at a time from pin to pin and move the entire stack from there to there, but never placing a larger disk on a smaller disk. It's a lovely children's puzzle. I rather liked it. If you look at it for a little bit or you play around with it for a little bit, you'll see it's not too difficult to do. Here you go, you identify sub-goals, satisfy those sub-goals, and then back up to your big goal. And eventually you end up with the whole stack moved from one place to the other. Why is this considered relevant? Why this problem, which is a kid's problem? Well, it's an intellectual feat. It requires pattern recognition. It requires planning. It requires reasoning. And there was a general sense in the early days of AI that intelligence was going to turn out to be something of the nature of computer programs. and that one could even consider trying to design what they called a general problem solver. That is, a system which was suited to solve any intellectual problem at all. So reasoning was seen as a well-defined domain, very important to human thought, which was going to be solved by writing computer programs. That all looks incredibly naive now. But it's many years later, and when you see some of these early problems, like you see a computer program which seems to solve this problem, which, you know, might take you a few minutes to solve, then that's kind of impressive. Here's an early one, and gives a flavor for why people really thought, oh my God, the machines are becoming sentient. This one is very early, from about 1970. It's a program called Shurdlu. There's a big story of how it got its name. It's an example of an early program in the good old-fashioned artificial intelligence sphere. That term has become its own acronym. We call it GOFI, good old-fashioned artificial intelligence. That's these old computer programs that display this naive hope that we could write down the rules with which we reason about the world. And here's, in this program in particular, the computer has a model of a simple block-like world. The colors are completely off here, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. And the user interacts by typing text at a computer terminal, and the computer responds with text at the computer terminal. And here's an example. The person says, or types, pick up a big red block. The computer types OK to demonstrate it knows what that means in its little model world. And here's an example. You know, language, natural language that we use is frequently ambiguous, something computer languages are not. And the person says, grasp the pyramid, and the computer has sufficient rules to deal with natural language to recognize that this is ambiguous, because there are at least two pyramids that that phrase could refer to. And the computer says, I don't understand which pyramid you mean. Now, there's no real understanding here. This is as intelligent as your toaster, right? But people are interacting with it using natural language, and it seems that it's displaying intelligent behavior. You can read the rest of it yourself, but it's a good example of how impressive these early, this is very early, artificial intelligence programs were. But I want to draw your attention once more to this fact that what's happened here is there's been a whole shift from the concerns of the psychology of the first half of the 20th century to focus on reasoning. You remember René Descartes shutting himself off from the senses, convinced that an evil demon could trick him about almost anything except his own existence. Descartes strongly believed that the mind was best when it was reasoning. He thought this was the correct domain of mind. And this obsession with reasoning finds a very clear expression in this early field of artificial intelligence. You might ask yourself, how important is reason to you? How good a reasoner are you? Is reasoning the central aspect of your mind that is most important? There are theological issues here. Later on we'll have a lecture on reasoning. We'll investigate this. But this is the grounds for early artificial intelligence. Anyway, we're not going to pursue this much further. This huge intellectual change, this language of information processing and the computer metaphor massively changed psychology, of course, and it gave rise to what we call cognitive psychology. Now, the cognitive psychologists were not going back to early days of psychology. They wanted to be just as scientific as the behaviorists, but because they had this new language, they could posit underlying elements, computational elements, like programs and parts of programs, that they presumed were instantiated in brains and that underlay your experience and that were responsible for your behavior. So they wanted to carry on being as scientific as any scientist, but unlike the behaviorists, they could appeal to stuff that you couldn't see or measure, because they said, well, we can model it. If we can build computer programs that display the right kind of behavior, given the right inputs, produces the right outputs, then we've really understood what's going on in humans, and then we can try and figure out how brains are doing all this. So cognitive psychology is work within this information processing paradigm. And let's be clear about this. If we adopt this stance, then we're viewing the brain as a kind of hardware, the thoughts as a kind of software. The inputs are what's coming in from the senses and giving rise to processes of perception, and the outputs are behavior or perhaps emotions and other mental states, I don't know. And this dominated the field from the early 1960s up until about the 1990s. This was pretty much the only game in town. That has changed. We'll see some reasons why it's changed. Cognitive psychology lives on to this day in exactly this form, but there are very many other kids on the block as well, very many competing approaches. So we need to be clear that this is no longer an accepted orthodoxy. There are many alternatives, and cognitive science is still young. Some reasons that things have changed. Well, if we take this good old-fashioned approach to artificial intelligence that believes that we were clever enough to write the rules which would inform a reasoning system about the world, we found we couldn't do it. It's too bloody hard. The world is too bloody complicated, and we're not clever enough. And this engineering approach of add more facts to the system, build in knowledge to the system, just doesn't scale up. And that might seem to be a dead end, except that the means by which people build these systems has radically changed as well. In 2016, we now have available to us huge data sets of natural language containing millions, billions of utterances of texts and such like. We have available to us huge data sets that were absolutely unthinkable even 10 years ago. We also have very powerful learning algorithms that can draw on these data and learn automatically from them, so we're not in the loop. We're farming out the job of designing the intelligent system. And this is paying off dividends. Maybe we understand, it doesn't further our own understanding of ourselves much, but we do get phenomenal results, and all of you have access to devices now that display highly intelligent behavior. You can speak into your machine and it will respond, and it will understand your question, and it will go and do web searches for you and try to guess what you're on about and give you stuff it thinks that you want. So Google and this whole approach of massive data sets and strong machine learning algorithms, something called deep learning, for example, all this has radically changed the field and is paying off, but at a cost. We've got away from the view that we were clever enough to engineer this, to write the rules explicitly by which we reason. So we're not learning too much about humans from this, although we're getting very fancy systems. Another change is that this obsession with one technical language of information processing has also changed. Information processing is not the technical language, the technical vocabulary of physicists or of biologists or of chemists. It was kind of unique to computer scientists and cognitive psychologists and engineers, I suppose. But the conventional way in which scientific theories are expressed, strongly quantitative scientific theories like physical theories, biological theories, and chemical theories, that language has always been dynamical systems theory. This is the mathematics that describes how change over time happens lawfully. It's the natural way it's expressed is using differential equations. Don't worry, we're not going to do any differential equations. But there has been a huge resurgence of interest in trying to address the problems of psychology and the problems of cognitive science using the same language as in the other natural sciences. And this is bearing some fruits as well, but it changes the game when you change the language, so we stop thinking about things as computers. Another big change, of course, is that we know a lot more about brains. So neuroscience is difficult, and we will examine a little bit what the quality of evidence is that we get from neuroscience and how it's relevant. But you've all seen pictures like these of shiny brains lighting up. Brains don't really light up. The only way to light up a brain is to take it out and set it on fire. Don't do that. Okay, brains do not light up. But these pictures have captured the public's imagination, and we have seen over the last couple of decades a huge increase in our ability to make pictures of what's going on inside brains. So neuroimaging has become a hugely important contributor to the discussion. We're not making stuff up. We're not guessing quite as much as we used to. So all this sort of takes us up to date, and this brings us to the end. But I want to wrap up this topic with by going back to something quite unscientific. Isaac Newton, who gave us the first complete physical theory, he was the first guy who put in place this theory of mechanics, the best physics of its day, and to this day probably the best physical theory that was ever built. Because it was building on very little, despite his claims. He was a bit of a weird guy, and back then people the divisions we have now between philosopher and scientists and public figure they weren't as clear. People weren't clear what they were. Descartes wouldn't have thought of himself as a philosopher. Newton didn't only think of himself as a scientist, and science was very young at that stage. This is the birth of science. He was also an alchemist. Alchemy was this weird business of mixing materials that you didn't quite understand to try and reach quite unreasonable goals. It's very Harry Potter-esque. So the Philosopher's Stone was a genuine goal of the alchemists, something that would lend eternal life. They were also busy trying to transmutate lead into gold, which of course would be a felicitous outcome if you're the guy who figures out how to turn lead into gold. It turns out it's quite difficult. So there was a lot of mad stuff going on and a wide variety of approaches, not all sharing the same set of goals. Alchemy doesn't exist anymore, so spare a thought for the poor old alchemist. But out of alchemy was born chemistry. Chemistry is a very, very much one of the hardest sciences that we have, one of the most solid sciences. And if you go and do a PhD in chemistry, you're working in a field with very clear rules and regulations, very clear expectations, and your PhD topic will be fairly well defined. It'll probably be given to you by your supervisor, and you won't be terribly surprised as you go along. Whereas if you were an alchemist, who knew what was around the next corner? There was lots of surprises in waiting. My suggestion is that cognitive science is probably better considered as being more or less in the stage of alchemy. That is still figuring out what it's about, still keeping many, many different approaches going, some of which are spinning off very, very solid, hard science, some of which will peter out and become irrelevant, as, for example, the early goals of artificial intelligence have more or less been discarded along the way, and that's fine. So it's a very exciting field to work in for precisely this reason, because you never quite know what's around the corner. And we're going to move on to our next topic, which is language. We've seen how language emerged as a touchstone around the middle of the 20th century. It became one of the main reasons that attention shifted from trying to understand behavior from the outside, as it were, to building these information processing models of minds. But we're not only going to focus on that. Language is a huge domain, extremely rich. You're all competent language users. You'd be very bored sitting here if you were not a competent language user. So you already know a lot about language, and language can be approached from very, very many angles. So many angles that I'm not sure we have a single well-defined science of language. We seem to have very many languages, very many sciences here, proto-sciences. So here's the first question for you all as language users. And I'm asking this to you, I want answers. Why do we have language? What's it for? Communication. Believe it or not, that was kind of what I expected, but what else is it for? I'm going to put that in with communication. In communicating, you're expressing yourself. It's funny, they were the first two answers I got this morning as well when I gave it. Organizing what? Thoughts. That's the other one I want to point out, which is that language plays a huge role in thought. In fact, didn't we just meet that with the language of thought, with the whole Jerry Fodor computational theory of mind? We had this idea that thinking is a lot like language. So these are quite different, because this is very much outward focused, lying between people, and thinking we tend to think of as sort of an introspective individual activity. And that's peculiar. We'll have to follow both of these strands. If an alien landed from Mars and really knew nothing and walked up to you and you got over your initial shock and the alien said, why do you have language? Communication is the first thing you'd point out, I think. But this role merits our attention as well, and has been extremely influential in developing modern cognitive science theories. We met Jerry Fodor, and he tried to bring the new science of syntax, I suppose, or at least the most recent version of the science of syntax, into thinking about thought, where he claimed that a thought like I would like a pie must have a structure something like I would like a pie. Now, I would like a pie is so simple you probably can't even see that. So I'm going to give you a more complicated sentence. And what I'm going to claim is that you couldn't have the thought unless you were able to formulate the sentence. So if three of us sneak in the back, we can steal at least a bag of apples without getting caught. Okay? You're a kid trying to rob an orchard and you're making plans. Look how complicated this is. First of all, we're dealing with if. So this is counterfactual. You're not dealing with something that's directly present. You're imagining something that's in some imagined future. There's quantification. You're able to count. At least a bag of apples is a weird way of dealing with quantities. It's very precise. You're envisaging at least two scenarios, because you say we might get caught. You're also, would you like not to get caught, you're also envisaging getting caught. So there's multiple possible futures are envisaged here with this sentence. How could you possibly do this unless you had something like language, something like this to, as you so nicely put it, to organize your thoughts? So this illustrates nicely how language provides us with a means for thinking complex matters that we would not otherwise have been able to express or to think. Jerry Fodor called the role of language in thought, he called it mentalese. The idea being that while you speak to yourself so often, you're probably not being quite this explicit if you're standing there quietly making plans, but underlying it is something very like what you would speak out loud if you were talking to someone. It's probably compressed. You probably have your own idiosyncratic shortcuts. That's why he calls it mentalese, as if it was a dialect, your own dialect of language. But this seems to me to make a strong argument that there are complex thoughts that we could not have unless we had the corresponding linguistic structures. So Fodor coined this term mentalese, and here's a couple of rhetorical questions for you. If we accept that sometimes there's a little voice in your head which is your thought, is that in English? Even though it's not directed at someone else, it probably is. I mean, you'd probably be able to say it. But if we're saying that, that makes it sound like you actually said the thoughts. If you think something, do you think in your own voice? Well, let me put against that. Can you think in someone else's voice? Yes, you can. Imagine groundskeeper Willie. There you go. You just thought in someone else's voice. So you can do that. So do your thoughts have an accent? That's kind of weird, isn't it? Now, we often think of thoughts as being very disembodied and intellectual. I'm going to point out to you that we are changed people. Writing came along about 5,000 years ago. Widespread literacy in the blink of an eye, only 500 years ago. And ever since then, we think of language as being something you can indifferently put down on a page or speak, and speaking seems sort of redundant. But prior to that, all language all the time was always spoken, so that the association between thoughts and speech would seem to be much stronger, perhaps, if we didn't have writing to fall back on as a means of thinking of language in a different way. These are hard questions. I don't expect you to answer them, and I won't ask you them in an exams. Here's even harder ones that, again, I won't ask you. But they're worth thinking about. First of all, let's recognize that it's not easy to say what a thought is or to say what thinking is. Like mind, it's one of those words that's a constant locus of negotiation. We don't have good answers. The question of whether thoughts are necessarily expressed in words is a big one, and it has engendered an awful lot of discussion within cognitive science. We've just made an argument that in some respects, having language allows you to formulate thoughts that you could not have thought of otherwise. When you get onto the required reading for this topic, for language, you'll find an interesting little piece by Oliver Sacks, who also died recently. God, we're losing a lot of them, aren't we? And he was considering whether people who don't have language can think. So if you're born deaf and you're not part of a signing community, and nobody signs around you, and you learn language at a much later point in life, learn to sign at a much later point in life, can you reflect on what experience was like beforehand, what your thoughts were like? It's very interesting reading, and it's not a simple question. And then you might ask yourself, well, if you call one thing or another thing thinking, is that the whole of your mental life? So right now, am I thinking when I'm speaking? Should we describe that as thinking? Are you thinking when you're listening? I'm not quite sure. They are rhetorical questions, but they just serve to suggest to you that there's an awful lot we don't know about thinking. So strong views here are probably going to be unhelpful. The language of thought hypothesis from Fodor is a specific strong view that one could adopt, but if you insist on it, you're probably being a little bit fundamental. That doesn't mean it's not helpful. This is explicit, and it suggests, as we said, that what thinking is computation over representations. Representation being the symbols or the data, computation being the rule-based reordering of them. And these Symbols stand for something outside of us. And this is the whole picture of the computational theory of mind. It's so important. We'll come back and we'll have a whole lecture or two on the notion of representations later. But for now, I want to leave it a little bit behind. Language is rich enough that it's going to feature in this module again and again and again, even after we're done with specifically addressing language. For example, when we get to study human development, which is interesting, how do we go from being mewling, helpless infants to being such incredibly sophisticated, complex, capable people as you all are? Well, the processes of development give us much food for thought, and one of the interesting landmarks is the way that children develop the ability to speak to themselves, to speak silently to themselves, because it's a definite landmark, and you learn to speak long before you learn to think, as it were. That is, young children seem to think out loud. So we can follow a little bit of this, the development of mental ease, when we get there. But for now, I'd like to come back to a more prosaic, everyday account of language, in which language is just stuff that helps us to get things done. It's one way of looking at it. Language is a kind of a tool that solves problems. And if you have language, there's lots of stuff you can do that you couldn't do otherwise. And we have a beautiful illustration of this from some chimpanzees. The chimpanzees in question, you know, there's been lots of attempts to try and teach other animals language. None of them have got very far. Apes have been the primary target, although arguably the best success so far has been with a grey parrot called Alex. Trying to get them to speak language is pretty much a hopeless task. We have different physiologies. Their larynx, their voice box is much higher. It's been tried, but nobody ever got anywhere like that. But we use sign language sometimes, so you can teach them to sign, and that's got fairly far. Or you can use symbols. You can use tangible symbols that can be rearranged on a screen, on a touch screen, for example. Chimpanzees can learn to use a touch screen fairly well. And in this particular case I want to describe to you, there was a chimpanzee named Sheba. And Sheba was being trained to use symbols, but not as far as what we would consider language. She was just using symbols as names for things, and that's obviously a first step. If you can't, before you can start forming sentences and rearranging symbols, you must have symbols. And she was specifically trained to use the symbols 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and she knew what these symbols meant. So if she saw the symbol for 5, she knew it meant a quantity of 5 things. Chimpanzees are quite good at maths. They have no problem keeping track of numbers up to and beyond 9. So she was trained in this. She knew what the symbols meant. And then the trainers developed a game with her, and it's kind of a mean game. They would have Sheba, who can deal with numbers, and they would have her together with another chimpanzee called Sarah, who wasn't numerically trained. She was just a regular chimpanzee, doesn't know what numbers mean. And the game works like this. The trainer would come out and would put down 2 plates of treats in front of Sheba. One has more than the other. One has clearly more than the other. Whichever plate Sheba points at, Sarah gets. Them's the basic rules. It's not a complicated game. Chimpanzees can learn this in a moment, right? The trouble is, it becomes clear Sheba wants the plate with the greatest number of treats, but she can't help herself. Every time the plates come out, she points to the one with the most and sees it go to Sarah, and she gets incredibly frustrated. And this happens again and again and again and again. It's really annoying. Now we change the game very slightly. We cover the 2 plates with lids, and we stick symbols on them saying how many treats are underneath. So now you bring out 2 plates, and one says 7 and one says 3. Sheba's no problem with this. She points to 3. 3 goes to Sarah. Sheba gets the 7. So she can solve, there's a problem to be solved here. The problem is quite clearly, how does Sheba get the most treats? She can solve it when there are numbers involved and not when she's looking at the treats. Think about that for a minute. Think about what the difference is. It seems like a trivial difference, but in one case where there's a symbol involved, she can do it. In the other case, she can't. Now, imagine, okay, we've already asked you to imagine yourself being starving pigeons in a box. Today's task is to imagine yourself being Sheba, presented with 2 plates of treats. You really want the plate with lots of them. So there's appetite, there's desire, and you can't help pointing at it. So you're caught up in this direct flow. Many of you who've had that urgent need for the 7th beer will know what I'm talking about. Absolutely have to have it now. The use of symbols, formally it's the same problem, but it turns it into an abstract intellectual reasoning problem. And a reasoning problem is quite far removed from this appetite-driven flow of the senses. And it allows Sheba to master the problem. So it's a really nice illustration of how even that precursor to language, the availability of symbols, allows you to solve problems that you couldn't otherwise have solved. So this is Sheba here, and you can, what I've just described to you is described rather briefly there. You can study that in your own time. But what's important here is that using these numerals, these symbols, freed up Sheba from the direct link between seeing and doing and allowed her to approach this like a good Christian reasoner, using her faculty of reason. Brilliant. Now, chimpanzees and gorillas and so on have never quite got language. And this is slightly odd. It's not so long ago, if you trace back through your father and mother and your grandparents, and you go back, how far back do you have to go until you find some body or thing which is equally closely related to the chimpanzees as it is to the humans? It's not 3 generations or 4 generations, it's a lot of generations. It's about 5 million years, 5 or 6 million years ago. It's not a lot of time between our last common ancestor. And in that time, about 1 million years ago, anatomically, I won't say anatomically correct, anatomically modern humans came into being. Now, we don't know exactly when we got language, but it wasn't 1 million years ago. Based on indirect sources of evidence, things like cave paintings, burial rites, musical instruments, jewelry and metalworking that speaks of technologies that have to be passed on from one person to another because there's too many complex bits to keep in your head. Based on these indirect sources of evidence, it seems that we definitely seems to have had language about 50,000 years ago. So somewhere in the intervening period, which from an evolutionary point of view is the blink of an eye, something happened and it profoundly changed our species, because with language, humans took over the world. We build up all our societies, all our cultures. Humanity is absolutely unthinkable without language. We'd be just another bunch of apes in the trees without language. But language changed the game completely. How did that happen? From an evolutionary point of view, it's a huge puzzle because the amount of time is not great. And what we have available to us modern apes, and there's very little differences. If you go looking at brains, or you go looking at bodies, there's very, very little differences here. Of course, it's a really interesting question, and it has exercised great minds. There's been so many theories for ages, that in 1866, the French Academy of Science banned theories about the evolution of language. This seems like an extreme measure. You have to appreciate the French institutions like banning things, like they dictate what language you should use, whether you're allowed to use the word weekend or not. So here they are trying to stem the tide, King Canute-like in 1866, saying, thou shalt not have a theory of the evolution of language. It seems weird, but the reason is science is a fragile institution, and in order for it to work, you have to be able to distinguish sense from nonsense. You have to be able to police that border. That's what scientists really do. They evaluate evidence, and they create good, solid stories. Here there was an absence of any empirical evidence, and there was lots of speculative stories, and there was no way to choose among them. So the Academy, the French Academy, basically said, look, that's not science at all. But you can't keep a good thing down. People are very happy to theorize about the evolution of language. We do so freely today. And you know what? We can do better than nothing. We can definitely do better than nothing. Here's the kind of question we can ask. Pre-adaptation. When we look at speech and listening, with all the parts of the body that are involved in language use, there's no part of the body evolved for language use. There's no part of the body that we have that chimpanzees don't have. There's no brain structures that we have that chimpanzees don't have. The voice box didn't evolve in order for us to speak. The voice box is much, much older. It's there to stop you choking as you eat your food. Every part of the body that's involved in speech and language predates speech and language and evolved for other purposes. So this is a question we can ask when we recognize that. What needs to be in place in order to facilitate the emergence of speech and language? These days we have the ability also to look at what the brain is doing in real time. It's damn difficult to figure out what it means, But we can look to see, does the brain treat speech sounds differently from other sounds, for example. If something is meaningful spoken language, does that influence the brain differently than something that's not language? So that wasn't available in 1866. We can run big computer simulations where we endow little computational agents with communication abilities, and we can evolve them and change them randomly and follow and see what kind of languages emerge. These kind of simulations, unthinkable in 1866. It's one way we can look at these kind of things now. There's lots of stuff we can do, in other words. The French Academy of Sciences was just wrong. The absence of a fossil record is not the only way to come at such questions. And of course, if you're going to ask where did language come from, what's the big domain that you'd want to look at? Genetics. We're talking evolution here, right? So genetics is a field that deals with that which makes one organism, one species, what it is, and how species change over time. So we might want to have a genetic story about language. In fact, given that presumably it was an evolutionary change that allowed humans to develop language, but it didn't happen in chimpanzees, if you go back to the 60s and the 70s, there was a conviction in many scientific fields that we would someday find that change in the genes that was responsible for language evolution. The answer, there's a very short answer to this. It's not as simple as that. There's no single genetic change that gave us language. There's very little genetic difference between us and apes, but more importantly, our understanding of what genes are and what genetics is has hugely changed in the last decade even. You go back to the 60s and 70s, there was a general view that the genes contained the information that would dictate the shape of the grown organism, what we call the phenotype. Perhaps some of you still believe that. Geneticists don't believe that anymore. It's not so long ago since we decoded the entire human genome and found we had way less genes than we thought, and we have less genes, humans have less genes than a grain of rice. So there's not, the genes are not what we thought they were. They're not instructions for building things. Since then we've come to recognize with a greater degree of sophistication what the delicate interplay is between genes and environments, the so-called field of epigenetics. So that genes are of course genes are hugely important in evolution and in human development, but they're not the determining factor that contains within it in sort of information form the future organism. That's not what they are. That's the short answer, but there's a longer answer here as well, which we'll just look at briefly, because there was one very interesting case, and this happened back in the 70s or 80s, where there was a family identified in England, known in the literature as the KE family. And over 3 generations, a lot, but not all the members of this family demonstrated a particularly rare language disorder called developmental verbal dyspraxia. That's a mouthful. You can't say that if you have the developmental verbal dyspraxia. It's kind of hard to articulate. And by looking at the pattern of inheritance, they could see that this was clearly a genetic basis to that. So you can do that if you have multiple generations and some members get something and some don't. You can look at the pattern of inheritance, figure out is it following the rules of genetics of inheritance, and this did, and that allowed them to hone in. They found the gene. Genes have funny names. This gene was called FOXP2. Trumpets, champagne, we found the gene for language. There was a lot of overblown speculation in the scientific and in particular in the popular press at this stage. But it didn't turn out to be the case. FOXP2 is found in all mammals, so it's not a new gene. There is a slight difference in FOXP2 between chimpanzees and humans. And it is the case that this mutation, that the FOXP2 gene is altered in the KE family and is responsible for whatever problems they have. But suggesting that the members of the family who had this disorder didn't have language would be simply wrong. They did have language. They had various difficulties in articulation, but they had other difficulties as well that were not clearly linguistic. They had cognitive deficits, learning deficits, late onset of language, lots of other things going on there as well. So the picture became much, much, much muddier. Since then, we found out FOXP2 in all kinds of animals, in mammals and in birds and so on. It influences the co-development of the brains and lungs. So it's not surprising that if you have something like that that plays that pivotal role, that a defect in it would influence speech. But people were far too eager back then, about 30, 40 years ago, to find a simple story. We found the gene for language, and it simply isn't the case. What I'd like to play for you now, just to finish up, is a video I found on YouTube not so long ago. It's a member of the family, KE, and I'd like him to tell you in his own words what kind of person he is. This is what YouTube is great for, because when I present something like this, it's easy to fail to remember that we're dealing with real people here. And I want you to make your own mind up about whether this person is lacking language.
Five things about me. Five things about me. Let me think. Number one, I have a rare speech disorder called FOX, PH2.
That's the gene, and he got the name wrong, but it's ballpark.
If you want to know more information about that, you can. If go to Google on the KE family. I'm famous in the medical history on that.
It's true.
Number two, I have a learning disability, but I can learn how to sort good things out from that. Number three, when I was born, I learned sign language. Patrick Gorman, then I changed to Macintyre, then I changed to British Sign Language. And from that, when I was young, I was non-verbal, so now I have achieved a lot in that. Number four, I love helping people in different ways, especially hearing or deaf in the deaf community. I've got a good passion and love about that.
I have to stop him there because we don't have much time. He's lovely. That's the first thing to say. He's a gorgeous guy. He has a learning disability, and he's completely upfront about it. And he spends a lot of his time now making videos for people, teaching them sign language. His own language development was delayed. And so he's worked all this into a really complex and wonderfully positive picture. So I think it's really touching to see someone who you just see in the medical literature. But clearly, this guy has language. Don't tell me this guy doesn't have language. He has a speech disorder, to be sure, and it's a general cognitive disorder. But I think it's, after viewing that, there's no way that you could say that, oh, well, the gene for language was damaged or gone in him. There's no such gene for language. We'll return to this story again on Tuesday.